The Fantastic Four are a staple of the Marvel Universe, both in the real world and publication history. As the story goes, in 1961, Stan Lee was becoming disillusioned by the work done within comics, and he considered leaving to pursue a writing career in a more prestigious medium. His uncle, Marty Goodman, who also happened to be the publisher, urged Stan to create a team of superheroes to rival the sales performance of National Periodical's publication's Justice League of America. Teaming up with Jack Kirby, the two would ignite the spark for the broader Marvel Universe. The Fantastic Four, comprised of Reed Richards, the Genius, Ben Grimm, the Muscle, Johnny Storm, the Rascal, and Sue Storm, the Girl. From the beginning, the team would be established to be cosmic explorers and superheroes, but more importantly, a family. Them being cosmic explorers was also a reflection of the 1960s fascination with space traversal, but them being a family provided for a refreshing take on superheroes. These stories allowed for the characters to have flaws, which was a differentiation from their predecessors. The Fantastic Four embodied the truth behind families, that it doesn't matter how much they bicker, they're always going to find their way back to one another at the end of the day. They represent an unconditional love that each member accepts of the other, flaws and all. The book is still looked back on fondly, even 80 years after the fact, because it represents two creators at the brink of career stagnation. This underdog story is a crucial building block in the foundation of Marvel Comics. Today we're going to be looking at a book that attempts to recapture the essence of the Fantastic Four and seeing if it too will stand the test of time. But before we get into that, let's hear a word from our sponsor. Nuff said. I want to extend a sincere thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel, get these videos early, and access to the community Discord, you can subscribe for as low as $1 per month. And if not, thank you for watching this video, and please subscribe. We're closing in on 2,000 subscribers, and I would love to hit that before the first year anniversary, June 14th. And now, back to the show. Life Story was created by Chip Zdarsky while he was over at Marvel Comics. It sought out to show these characters as they age in real time, as opposed to Marvel's sliding timescale, which is really just an explanation for why they don't age. The line would envision to showcase the lives of each of the iconic characters of Marvel, crafting a narrative and ridding these characters from the ever-looming illusion of change. Life Story would reimagine these characters to be molded by their lived experiences as opposed to being in the main line and the never-ending status quo. Originally, when Chip had pitched this idea to editor Tom Brevoort, he had tried to do a reimagining of the entirety Marvel Universe, but Tom urged Chip to just focus on Spider-Man. This would not only provide for an individual protagonist, but also being able to bypass the burden of a dense continuity for the whole 616. Ah yes, Spider-Man, a character who is well equipped to change and a fan base that I'm sure is able to be pleased. That was sarcasm. Zdarsky would write the 6-issue series alongside long-standing Spider-Man artist Mark Bagley. The series would debut in March of 2019 and result in issue 1 selling 54,000 copies. Throughout Spider-Man Life Story, we would witness this Peter Parker traversing a new timeline, one that was unforgiving and unyielding in its barrage of twisted events. The series would show a new perspective on the character, as each issue would jump from from decade to decade, starting in the 1960s with Peter being 19 years old and ending in the 2010s with Peter being 72. These time jumps would be an effective narrative through line through the series, but also a case study of how much one man can take. In the main line, there's this illusion of change where characters will routinely just revert to their status quo. Readers know that at the end of the day, another creative team will come in and the character will revert. So there's an unspoken safety in the character's well-being. It's made very apparent in life story that no characters are safe, and they'll even stray wildly from their mainline counterpart as events are explored through their logical conclusion. If you're interested in this book, I highly recommend watching the video from OwenLikesComics, which will be in the top right hand corner. The book would be met with critical acclaim, and shortly thereafter, Marvel would greenlight another entry into the life story framework. On February 3rd, 2021, Marvel would announce a follow-up to Spider-Man Life Story. This new installment would be centering the Fantastic Four. To the surprise of many, Zdarsky and Bagley would not be returning for this series, and instead they would be bringing on the writer Mark Russell and penciler Sean Izaakse. Up to this point, Mark Russell had been known for his satirical work on The Flintstones and Second Coming. These books would be a darkly comedic reflection of American politics at the time, and also use not so subtle allusions to the modern day. He would take these pre-existing ideas that embodied the unassuming joy and then turn them to reveal this darkness under the surface. Utilizing narratives, he would pontificate on the human condition, and he would also do an autopsy on the veneer of optimism. In practice, Russell was able to convey these larger ideas without talking down to the reader. For example, Second Coming asked the question, if Jesus returned today, would he take issue with the world that he left behind? Throughout a narrative that was obviously well researched, Russell explored the contradictions of the teachings from Jesus in the Bible and how prosperity gospel had co-opted these ideas for financial gain. The story was originally set to publish at DC's Vertigo imprint, but because of mounting pressure towards the publisher, DC canceled the title and allowed for Russell to take the series over to independent publisher Ahoy Comics. This is where I first became aware of Russell as a writer, because I saw the reaction that this book had, but I didn't understand why one comic could have such a backlash. It was at that point that I started following Mark Russell's career. I would support every new project that he had releasing, as I wanted to recapture the profound impact that Second Coming had on me. I say all of this to give the proper context for my perspective going into this book. Spoilers, I'm not a fan. The reason I chose this book is because I wanted to deconstruct my feelings that I had towards it. It's easy to say that you hate something, but it's difficult to understand why, and more importantly, articulate it. I highly recommend reading the book and forming your own opinion. Don't let me, a guy with way too much time on his hands, let me influence your perspective. Before we get into issue 1, there's something that I need to leave you with to think out through the entirety of the coverage on this video. It's a quote from Mark Russell talking about the character motivations for each member of the Fantastic Four. Reed wants to save the world, Sue wants to change the world, Johnny wants to have a good time, and Ben wants the love that has been denied to him. In short, there's a little of them in all of us. Keep that in mind, we're going to be coming back to it. Issue 1 begins in the 1960s with John F. Kennedy consulting Reed Richards regarding the president's promise to put a man on the moon. We can surmise that Richards is already established to be an accomplished scientist, thus earning his position to alter the theoretical into the practical. For proper context, after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union began a power struggle over world dominance. Both were vying for nationalistic realistic exceptionalism, and at the same time in an arms race for weapons of mass destruction. While the stockpiling of nuclear weaponry was in secret, both nations raced to colonize the final frontier. This was seen as the symbolic representation of achieving said exceptionalism. JFK was seen to be the embodiment of American idealism and being the leader to shepherd the US into the age of the future. And you know what happened to him? Boom! Headshot! This cultural consciousness would breathe new life into the movement towards futurism. This in part was due to radical innovations in technology, which was seen to propel humanity into the future. This new age would be the establishment of a utopia where we live in harmony and utilizing technology for a better tomorrow. Well, I don't know how close we are to that, but I do have a pocket computer where I can order food off of my phone and not have to talk to anybody. So win-win. Speaking of, this video is sponsored by DoorDash. You can see this permeation of the idea towards traversing the stars just looking at what was coming out at the time, and more specifically Star Trek airing in 1966. This new frontier allowed for Americans to take part in escapism and being able to rid themselves of the grim reality of the time. The Fantastic Four were spawned out of the optimism towards futurism. While superheroics are in their DNA, literally, at their foundation, they're also cosmic explorers. At the time, they would disrupt the notion of what we thought a superhero could be, and instead reflected the world around us. We all know the Marvel saying, "The world outside of your window." This was a saying that at its inception was used to differentiate the Marvel universe from their distinguished competition. The Fantastic Four, and subsequently Marvel, wouldn't settle for allowing the reader to escape to a new world, but instead brought that fantasy to the reader.
There are a lot of really fun moments in this book, and I think the art is terrific, and I think that like when the book shines, it shines very well, and there's moments that make use of the time period really nicely. Like I think the first issue is really solid because it feels so integral that it is set in the 1960s, because you know the Fantastic Four's origin is so tied to the space race and to that kind of sense of optimism that came in the early 60s with JFK and everything that was going on in America at the first half of that decade, and then how that takes a very dark turn after Kennedy's assassination. And the way in which Russell uses that in this first issue reminds me a lot of the first issue of Grant Morrison and Mikel Janin's Superman and the Authority, which is a book I have a real fondness for, of how Morrison frames that's a story of an older Superman at kind of the end of his career, questioning whether or not he has changed the world for the better. And it's framed narratively around a conversation he had with President Kennedy in the 1960s, right before Kennedy's assassination, where Kennedy asks Superman to use his powers to unite the world and make a better place for everyone. There's moments in the first issue of this that remind me of that, and I really like that because I think it's a really fun metatextual thing of bringing the Fantastic Four back into the context they were created into and playing into the real world politics and the kind of socio-political goings on in America at that time, and how that kind of unbridled optimism of this kind of early 60s space age futurism kind of falls out as we get into the prolonged Cold War into the 70s and the 80s. And I think telling a Fantastic Four story through that setting is a really, really cool idea.
Moving back to the story, it's shown that there was another scientist consulted to be a part of JFK's space program, Ricardo Jones. Jones believes that Reed's design proposal would be ineffectual, but is shut down by Kennedy when he argues that the only way to do the impossible is to attempt the improbable. This begins the domino effect of changes to the origin that will later culminate in larger ramifications. This places the rivalry dynamic between Reed and Ricardo, a specific dynamic that is typically reserved for one Victor Von Doom. The narrative then fast forwards to Reed working in this program when he receives a call from Susan Storm. Sue is established to be an engineer in her own right and already in a relationship with Reed. He laments on the difficulties in the program and wishing to have her accompany him, as she is more accomplished. and yet still a woman in the 60s. It's revealed that the program is being tabled as Jones had reported the antimatter fuel source to be untested and therefore unsafe. Reeling from this loss, Sue proposes that the two could test the aircraft themselves by sneaking into the NASA facility. Johnny Storm, Sue's younger brother, overhears the conversation and blackmails them into taking him along. Reed reluctantly agrees, but they're gonna need a pilot. Enter Ben Grimm. This is the point in the series that my frustration began. Ben and Reed have no relationship prior to this introduction, and it's detrimental for the ideas that Russell is attempting to capture. In the mainline, Reed and Ben have been longtime friends since they were roommates in college. Their relationship and the subsequent tragedy of the Thing cuts so deep because they have these bonds. Ben is Reed's closest friend, and yet the world's smartest man can't fix the one man that he holds dear. This dichotomy has been explored by multiple other creators, but it's this failure that humanizes both of them. It's also not lost on me that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are basically self-inserted to these characters. Reed Richards, the scatterbrained genius, something that I know only Stan Lee would use to self-aggrandize himself. Ben Grimm, the hot-headed brawler, literally being the manifestation of Jack Kirby's Jewishness, as the Thing represents the golem that comes from Jewish folklore. Both creators incorporated this cultural yearning for sci-fi and exploration into everything that they did, and their work dares to realize this yearning onto the page. In Life Story, Ben is a veteran who was dishonorably discharged for a reason that we don't find out until later. I take issue with this, not because of the fandom brained, it's different, but instead that the foundation has now been altered. In the Spider-Man series, we're introduced to the universal constants of what we know to be true in Spider-Man books. And as the story progresses, then we start to see the alterations. In this book, we start with an unsettled foundation, so the alterations in the future don't feel earned as a result. After recruiting Ben to their crew, because Johnny somehow knows him, they venture off to board the spacecraft. They embark on their adventure into the stars, and that's when we're treated to the familiar sight of their contact with the belt of cosmic rays. This is when Reed is plagued with the presence of Galactus. Galactus in the series is treated as a Lovecraftian omen, one that personifies the horrors of perceiving the incomprehensible. Personally, I read it as the manifestation of the anxieties of space exploration, meaning, while we can traverse the cosmos, should we? And if we do, what threats lay dormant until they're discovered?
I have seen very few depictions of Galactus that strike that same level of awe and grandiosity and fear since like Kirby. And with that, I will say that like Russell's decision to present Galactus is almost this like horror villain, this kind of constant looming threat that at any point in the book, you could turn the page and Galactus could show up. And for the characters, they are walking on these perpetual eggshells of they could wake up tomorrow and Galactus is there to destroy the world. It is this just constant looming threat of any day. Whatever this is coming. And I think that like it's a really good handling on Galactus in that sense. And I think it's a no-brainer why the movie seems to be pulling a lot of its inspiration of how it presents Galactus from this. Because while I have issues with how it handles the kind of four main characters, I think its use of Galactus in tying it to the Fantastic Four's origin and how it presents him in the Surfer is really solid and good and very visually cinematic as well.
Cut to the Fantastic Four returning home and in the safety of the American government. They discover their newly gained abilities and quickly rise to the status of not only superheroes, but celebrities. Throughout a montage of their feats, the resentment from Ben towards Reed is routinely elaborated upon, with Ben laying the blame at the feet of Richards. And honestly, yeah, I get it. Imagine you had your life fundamentally altered because you trusted the supposed smartest man on Earth. Adding insult to injury, the only reason you were roped into this mess was because of a dumb kid that you apparently know very little. It's safe to say that Ben and Reed have a rocky relationship. I'm so sorry. Time passes, Reed and Sue get married, JFK dies, and the family meets the Beatles. There's another recurring aspect of the series that takes place in this time that I just find puzzling. Sue is shown to be marching with Black Americans in a panel that's supposed to represent the civil rights movement. The signs that are held call for the equality in housing and job opportunities. Yet the importance of this movement is just relegated to a cameo. I do understand that the story is traveling at a breakneck pace, but this moment reads as tone deaf when you slap it right in the middle of the Fantastic Four meeting the Beatles and Reed brooding. It's more disturbing to bring back the civil rights movement in yet another time skip, only to show that nothing has changed in this time. It's moments like these that use American history in the same way that the MCU teases interconnectivity. This isn't a moment of reflection, but instead it's a lazy narrative device to display to the reader that it is a period piece. Considering that Russell's expertise is in satirical narratives, I kind of expected a further dissection into this, just as a means to display the dichotomy between privilege and inequality, and yet it's just completely overlooked. Moving forward, Reed is plagued by the looming presence of Galactus, desperately attempting to uncover the truth of his vision. Simultaneously, we witness a recreation of the iconic Lee Kirby story, This Man, This Monster, where Ben Grimm grapples with his disfigurement and his place in the world. This is when Ben is approached by Ricardo Jones, with a contraption to restore his humanity, and unknown to Ben, will provide Jones with the opportunity to impersonate him, attempting to dispose of Reed Richards. While disguised, Jones arrives to the Baxter building and immediately jumping in to assist Reed and Sue with a new project that hopes to find Galactus. He joins Reed in this contraption, hoping that this will provide the opportunity for the perfect murder. However, the mechanism transports them to the depths of space and just in front of Galactus. Galactus gives them a warning that he is coming for Earth, and more specifically Reed. Jones panics at the otherworldly being and reaches to save Reed, thus sacrificing himself and stating that he is the only one who can save humanity. This contact fundamentally alters Reed moving forward, as he becomes increasingly obsessed with the preservation of Earth and as a result sacrificing his mental well-being. At the end of the issue, Ben returns to the family and reconciles with Reed. It's also revealed that Sue and Reed are having their first child named Franklin. The meeting of Galactus is the largest departure from the mainline universe and will have disastrous ramifications moving forward. Like I was saying previously, in Spider-Man Life Story, we go in with the essentials that we know Peter Parker to be. They never show the origin of how Peter Parker got his powers because the narrative trusts the readers that they can fill in the gaps. This book not only showcases the origins of the Fantastic Four, but also disrupts the foundation, and it feels like it's talking down to the audience. I mean, it's practically just putting it in big red letters on the biggest sign that you can see, and it says, "Hey, we're different." Yeah, man, we knew when we were picking up this book. As a result, the forthcoming alterations read as hollow, as these changes are significantly less iconic than the ones that were presented in the Lee Kirby run. With the incorporation of so many parallels, it's hard not to compare them, and in doing that, you're only setting yourself up to be the second best at what you're trying to do. Issue 2 changes the narrative perspective from Reed to Sue. This point of view will rotate with each issue moving forward. We open as Sue and Franklin attend a lecture by Reed at a scientific symposium sponsored by Stark Industries. Once Reed's lecture makes its way to speaking on Galactus, he's mocked by other attendees as an overzealous fraud. Although seemingly uneventful, the same convention would allow for Reed to meet Tony Stark, Hank Pym, and most importantly, Victor Von Doom. Sue sees herself as living in the shadow of Reed. She believes that his quest to warn of the Leviathan exceeds his ability to care for her. This feeling is elaborated upon when the narrative shows Ben, Reed, and Johnny adventuring out to stop a plot by the Mad Thinker, leaving Sue to stay at home and care for Franklin. The issue also introduces an expanded cast of superheroes, including Black Panther, Namor, and Captain America. They're used to display the growth of the superhero community in the wake of the Fantastic Four's formation in the 60s. Their timeline timeline of careers are made vague, so we are to infer they only began after the 60s. This choice is perplexing because Captain America and Namor debuted during World War II, so erasing their history is only really utilized to bolster the importance of the Fantastic Four. Historically, it does make sense because the creation of the Fantastic Four would then result in so many more heroes coming forward because they're the originating point of Marvel's success. For example, Namor and Black Panther would gain a new readership and popularity because of their cameos within the Fantastic Four title. If the intention was to set up the team as the cornerstone of this universe, I don't think that the narrative really explored what that means and why everybody respects them. Sue's feeling of being eclipsed by her husband comes to a head when she isn't informed of a meeting of the superheroes, as Reed believed it was a waste of time. His fixation with the looming threat of Galactus has forced him deeper into his work, sacrificing his relationships. Yet his bond with Victor grows. The heroes plan to speak in front of the United Nations in an effort to express their vision for the world. Sue immediately accepts, as this fulfills her sense of belonging as well as her desire to change the world. Sue's quest for liberation is exemplified with a sequence depicting her active in women's rights marches and meeting Betty Friedan, author of The Feminine Mystique. This era of women's liberation sought out for equality in the autonomy of oneself. It would allow for them to have the right of self-determination. It's an inspired decision to focus on the perspective of Sue, but like the previous issue, we don't give it much real estate to actually fulfill what it's setting out to do. The 70s were a fundamental change in the American consciousness. This is a result of the American military imposing imperialistic conquest on Vietnam. This sentiment was the awakening of the American consciousness of the atrocities that were carried out by their government. This would result in the disillusionment of American exceptionalism. Once again, this defining moment of the nation's history is relegated to a cameo for 2 appearances in 1 issue. This could be a perfect time to deconstruct America's despondency in their government, and specifically utilizing superheroes as an establishment of propaganda, yet no exploration is here to be found. This critique can really be levied at both life stories because they get too wrapped up in the narrative of the superhero myth to really deconstruct the politics of the times. I'm not trying to propose that the protagonists of each stories should be sitting in Senate hearings, but at least reflecting the sentiment of the time in each decade. Instead of exploring this, the superheroes just go to the UN and talk in front of all of the different nations with nebulous platitudes of establishing a better world. And this is kind of what I'm talking about with superheroes being authoritarian and imposing their will on other countries. At the same time, Victor reveals that his true plan wasn't to defend the world, but instead to impart his will onto it. This would be an interesting turn if the superheroes weren't just doing the exact same thing through non-violent means. Victor knocks out Reed after he betrays his assumed alignment, and Victor attacks the UN as a show of force to bend the world's leaders to his will. Reed arrives late, attempting to talk him down, yet Victor declares Dr. Doom's sovereignty over Earth. And then he's immediately dispatched by Sue. #girlboss. At this point, Sue leaves Reed for Namor, attaining her desired independence as Reed begins his depressive spiral. There's so many ideas that are presented here that I'm such a big fan of, that the concept is better than the execution. Like the 70s issue of going through Sue's perspective during the time of women's liberation. I think that that is beautiful.
That is what these kind of books are for. Like you talked earlier about the subplot in Spider-Man life story about Captain America in Vietnam and how that could be a book in and of itself. The same here, like what it means for Sue as this well-educated middle-class woman of a kind of position and status as a celebrity celebrity and a prominent superhero, to be kind of living through the feminist movement and being this kind of symbol of female empowerment is such a cool concept to play with. And the book does get into it here and there, but it's like, I would have loved to see a lot more of that.
Issue 3 transitions to the perspective of Johnny Storm, which up to this point has played a minor role in the series. If we refer back to the character motivations set by Russell, Johnny just wants to have a good time. This could have been explored through the perspective of a child that's trying to piece his family back together. That would be an analogy for children of divorce. Instead, Johnny's just like this amorphous side character that has no development, and the only time that he brings the family together is in his death. Spoilers, I guess. However, in saying that, this issue is a standout for me. Johnny's perspective provides for a depth that I was waiting on leading up to this moment. And also, he's a parallel for Franklin's experience in the wake of his parents splitting. Johnny is able to see the people around him as more than just made up of their flaws and refuses to let them succumb to cynicism. The issue also establishes Reed and Sue in the wake of their separation. Reed attempts to warn literal demon Ronald Reagan of the threat that Galactus poses to no avail. Of course, later in the issue, Reagan would accept the assistance of the Mad Thinker as he attempts to covertly accumulate influence and authority. Would you look at that? Ronald Reagan is a bad guy. Who would have thought? After gaining this influence over the Reagan administration, Mad Thinker is able to spring Dr. Doom from custody, preparing the next phase of further domination. This plan would be playing on the paranoia of the ongoing Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union, and furthering the dependence on the United States onto the Mad Thinker. More dependence equals a wider influence. This is the level of quality that I was waiting for leading up to this point when it comes to political analysis. It's a means to utilize superheroes to be a reflection for the sentiment at the time, but also to deconstruct the world and the politics that led up to the world that we know it to be today. Granted, this has been done better in a plethora of other books, even some releasing during the time like the 80s, but it's welcome. The Mad Thinker puts on his best Ozymandias impression, concocting a new scheme by manipulating the United States into direct conflict with the Soviet Union, launching a nuclear warhead at the US, allowing for both sides to escalate military action. Sue and Namor witness the news report, and Namor dismisses the concern. He says that they can retreat to Atlantis, allowing for the world to devolve into chaos. When Sue rightfully points out not only the potential and unnecessary losses of life, but also the life of her son, Namor uncharacteristically says that they can start again. Wow, Stepfather of the Year award. Sue immediately leaves him, and thus we see no further appearances for the rest of the series. Namor is just one of the characters that are complex, but are whittled down to dehumanizing archetypes. Why does Namor respond in a way that's kind of agnostic to saving the world, when up to this point, his entire thing was backing Sue in saving it? Well, it serves the plot for one scene, and it's also there to make sure that Sue leaves him and will eventually go back to Reed. While I do understand that the pacing doesn't really allow for elaboration, it doesn't excuse why characters don't act like humans. This point will only become more relevant as we move on and when speaking about Doctor Doom. I like Namor as a character, just, you know, an anti-hero adjacent, I guess, but just kind of like a moral dilemma. He's good enough to fight in World War II, but now he's kind of like an antagonist sometimes, a friend sometimes. He has a complex relationship, and I wish that could have been further dived into with like what his relationship is to Reed or Johnny or Ben. Like, how do they feel about him? And it's quickly just, he's the rebound for Sue. And that's all of the characterization that he gets.
Which again falls into that complaint we have of like, I think that the idea of these life story books are really good, but they're so harmed by the 6-issue format. It forces these characters to kind of be the most abbreviated versions of themselves. And when you do that as a writer, whether you intend to or not, you can often rely on tropes and stereotypes and just general like, well, the the readers know who this character is, so I don't have to go into it massively because I don't have time. I've only got 30 pages an issue and I've only got 6 issues. And like, I think if this was a 10-issue book or a 12-issue book, I think some of my frustrations with this series may have been alleviated because Russell would have had more time to flesh out and give these characters a bit more nuance.
Russell admittedly said that he didn't follow the framework that Zdarsky had laid. Instead of the painstaking attention to detail, Russell just kind of took the concept at its core, letting the characters age in real time. From a practicality perspective, I do think that asking every creative team to put the same level of preparation into the book that Zdarsky did is a tall order. However, it's also a reflection of how much that you are willing to prepare when writing a book. While on one hand, we have Zdarsky who's penning a love letter to the mythos of Spider-Man, on the other, we have Russell who's basically just playing a game of telephone, which is loosely remembering what happened in the Lee Kirby run and then just doing it worse. So Sue returns to the family, and they, along with other heroes that are dressed in their 80s garb, attempt to stop the incoming and outgoing missiles. When all of them are taken out, one last stray warhead shoots off and is seemingly unable to be stopped. Now you might be asking, what about the other heroes that were set up that do have the ability to fly? Why don't they help stop that rocket? And like before, they're not the ones that need to be there to die to serve the plot. I mean, you just had Thor, a literal god, and Iron Man, who is notorious for dismantling weapons of mass destruction. Yet they just magically disappear when it's not an opportune time for the story that you're telling. I think I might be going insane. Johnny is the one who had to stop this rocket, which in doing so results in his death. This death brings the remaining members back together, building a further bond between them to unite their grief. So while I do enjoy this issue for the characterization of Johnny, it's not without its flaws. It suffers from an onslaught of problems that derive from its pacing, but also not allowing for characters to be human.
The Spider-Man life story creates a very solid template for other books to do in a really interesting way. And I did kind of expect going into it that we were going to see a similar approach. And you can visualize what that book would be like. You know, an issue where you have She-Hulk joins the team and you do kind of some of that, the John Byrne kind of 80s New Fantastic Four run. You get into the present day and you do, you know, the introduction of Valeria in the 1990s, who is a character who shockingly is not in this book, given how much of the screen time is not only dedicated to Franklin, but also to Sue and to Duke. It would think that Valeria would be a no-brainer for the end of the book. And the fact that she is just not introduced or used is kind of wild to me. The book kills off Johnny Storm, which is an incredibly famous moment in Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four. And it happened, like, that could have been the end of like the 2000s issue. And that's what leads into an older Reed and Sue forming the Future Foundation, because they are trying to safeguard the future of this world as they're starting to kind of age out. You can kind of connect the dots and think of how you could take the format that Zdarsky and Bagley use. And I respect that Russell was like, no, I want to tell this story and I want to do it my way. And I do commend him for that. And I think it would have been a shame for him to sacrifice his vision to just follow this strict editorial mandate. But I do think it leaves a lot to be desired as a result.
Issue 4 is presented through the perspective of Ben Grimm, detailing what has transpired since the death of Johnny Storm. We pick up in 1994 with everything seemingly being fixed in the wake of the last issue. The Soviet Union folded, which now allowed for the United States to redirect their funding from military escalation and now towards the global defense initiatives, led by Reed Richards, to protect Earth from the arrival of Galactus. Simultaneously, we see Stark Industries as they shift their focus from being a weapons manufacturer and instead redirecting towards technological innovations to combat threats like climate change. The nation of Wakanda has united the African nations and also releases the cure to AIDS. This is a great idea in theory, but it left me baffled in its execution. It's overly simplistic to say that a brush with mutually assured destruction would then lead to a time of a utopian society. The world, and more specifically America, has never just had one problem. In this story alone, we've already seen the perspective of African Americans in America and women in America. It's incredibly short-sighted to say that the overcoming of one foreign adversary would then change the trajectory of America as we know it today. Additionally, I do think that it's woefully ignorant to say that after this conflict, Stark Industries, a weapons manufacturer, would then seek out to make technology to better the world. It's kind of a proposition that arms manufacturers could then transition to be helping the world, but it's overlooking the past history of America's involvement in the Middle East. In the 90s alone, America led the charge for the Gulf War. This conflict occurred because of Iraq's occupation of Kuwait, who was led by Saddam Hussein. You know him, the same Saddam Hussein that the United States backed in the late 80s to make sure that there was a slowing down of the Soviet Union's involvement in the Middle East. In saying all of this, the United States basically functions as profit-seeking and world domination. The government manufactures the consent of the population through the propaganda of being anti-commie in the 80s and then the war on terror in every time even up to now. The framing of America to be able to de-escalate the military-industrial complex is laughably ahistorical. Speaking of which, it's quite tone-deaf to have Wakanda and Africa in general be the ones who have to cultivate the cure to AIDS. While that epidemic overwhelmingly impacted the Black community, it's almost treated like a problem that they need to fix for themselves. When you showcase America and the companies within it to focus on global utopian society, it's weird that they're treating it like this cure needs to be outsourced to Black-led nations. It's even more incomprehensible that the AIDS epidemic radically escalated under the watchful eye of one Ronald Reagan. What's that quote from Deadly Class again? Now, I don't think that all of this was intended, but it's kind of a symptom of a larger problem when talking about these societal issues. A common pitfall that writers fall into is whenever they're talking about societal issues and they have their superhero just solve it. Honestly, it just reads as arrogance, as the writers think that they are smart enough to come up with a fix. Readers and thus society don't need answers, because at the end of the day, they fail to contextualize the differing perspectives. Instead, it's better and more effective to propose these questions for implementation. You can do this by asserting the problem, allowing for the readers to come to their own conclusion based on the story and their perspective, and then they can better interact with the subject at hand. No author worth their salt is offering solutions, but instead they're allowing their audience to make their own conclusions based on the interpretation of the work. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now. In the story, we follow Ben as he catches up with the other surviving members of the Fantastic Four. Sue is still grappling with the loss of her brother. Franklin is getting married. Reed remains hard at work on the Galactus project. He even retools the designs of an AI by the Mad Thinker to take his place if he were ever unable to continue his work. Subtle foreshadowing. We'll get back to this later. Ben reunites with a previous love interest, getting closure on their relationship and his transformation. From this moment, we're able to witness as Ben becomes more confident in himself and branch out into the dating world. This leads to a blind date with Alicia Masters. Get it? Because disabilities. They hit it off immediately, but as time passes, Ben begins to distance himself from Alicia. He believes that it's because of his reaction to receiving affection and what the pain of this relationship could do to him. This is when Ben arrives to Alicia's apartment to fully divulge the source of his hesitancy, the reason he was dishonorably discharged from the military. During the Korean War, him and other soldiers were stationed close to an orphanage. Ben took to the kids and would sneak them candy as well as playing with them to cheer them up during the time of war. That is, until one day he came to the orphanage and he saw an influx of new children, all badly injured. He discovered that those children came from an area that the United States soldiers had just bombed. They were told that it was only populated by adversaries, so he didn't pay it much mind until this moment of realization. He returned to the base, punched the general in charge of the operation, operation and absconded with plenty of rations for the children. Cut to the modern day, and Ben tells Alicia that this is the burden that he carries. It's a weight on his shoulders that he feels the desire to find redemption. Alicia assures Ben of her love for him and understanding his inner turmoil. She has a beautiful line that says, "Sometimes the scariest thing about falling in love is feeling like you deserve it. But you do deserve it, you know? We both do." And they finally embrace. This scene gives a sense of humanity that is practically synonymous with the Fantastic Four, but up to this point has been completely missing. The foundation of this team is based around family and acceptance, which begs the question, where has this been since issue 1?
That moment in issue 4, I think it is genuinely like, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about that sequence. I think it's such a wonderful, that would fit in any great Fantastic Four run for me. And it's a shame that the book isn't filled with more moments like that, because there's clear bits in this story where I feel like Russell does have a really good handling on some of these characters. Like he clearly, those moments show that like he clearly has a really good reading of who Ben Grimm is and the inherent tragedy of that character and how important his relationship with Alicia is and how great they are together. But it's just kind of like, and this is a problem that a lot of Fantastic Four runs fall into, is that they become the Reed Richards show. And I'm aware of the irony of me saying that while also talking about how he's my favorite character. But too often, and even in Fantastic Four runs I love, the other characters sometimes feel supporting and secondary because everything has to funnel through Reed. And I think that when you kind of, I don't want to say when you get Reed wrong, but when you kind of are a little bit clumsy with how you use that character and some of the stereotypes it perpetuates and falls into, it does hurt everything else. Like the fact that Reed doesn't really have a connection with Ben before the mission, I think really hurts their dynamic because, you know, we talked earlier about how the rocket and the mission is this tragic story that kind of haunts Reed and is this motivation for creating the Fantastic Four and everything that he does. But the inherent tragedy with Ben is that this is his childhood best friend. This is someone that he grew up with, that protected him, that helped him when Reed was, you know, very socially awkward and introverted. Reed is the guy that kind of like picked him out of whatever situations he was in and looked after him and was kind of this big brother figure to him. And in return, he's destroyed his life and turned him into a horrific rock monster. You know, that's such a tragic tale. And for him to just be this kind of, this guy that they get out of a bar that they've never met before, that like, I think Johnny met on Craigslist or whatever.
Johnny happens to know him.
Just
and he's
knows.
Like 14.
It loses a lot of the emotional weight. And then when you combine that with the choices that Russell makes with kind of how Reed and Sue's relationship plays out and Reed's kind of strained relationship with Franklin, I think it does kind of hurt the team dynamics, which is and obviously the fact that Johnny isn't present for half the book. This is supposed to be a book about the history of the Fantastic Four, and it turns out to mostly be a kind of tragic story of these three broken people who are not really together for a lot of it.
Moving on in the story, we witness Franklin marrying Zawandi, sister of T'Challa. At the reception, Reed attempts to reconcile his relationship with Sue, but she shows hesitation. She says that while she loves him, he is unable to truly live, but instead building a monument to the idea of life and the man he wishes he was. This is when Reed is once again plagued with the presence of Galactus. He rallies the family and they immediately shoot off to space to confront the threat. Once they arrive, Reed says he can no longer feel the presence and it must be someone or something else. This is when the Silver Surfer presents himself, and without a second of hesitation, Ben engages in combat. Surfer deflects Ben, sending him hurling towards the sun. Reed positions the ship to catch Ben, and Surfer beams towards Earth. After circling the planet multiple times, Surfer arrives to the United Nations to address the world and provide notice. Your defenses are worthless. I destroyed them with barely an effort, and I am 1,000th as powerful as he is. It's too late for you, people of Earth. I suggest you make whatever peace you can. Tell yourselves whatever you need to do in order to find meaning in the end. For my master will arrive 10 years from now. Galactus is coming, and there is nothing you can do about it. We pick up with the family in 2002. Through the eyes of Franklin, the world has seemingly just accepted their fate. Conflict conflict is pointless if there is a due date. This doesn't stop the efforts by Reed, attempting for any last-ditch effort to stop Galactus by any means necessary. Silver Surfer presents to the family with an offer. He says that when Galactus came for his planet of Zenn-La, he too had a connection with the World Eater. He made an offering to Galactus, spare his world, and he will become his herald, a certified sommelier of planets to consume. Surfer explains that he's dying, and Galactus will need a new herald. If anyone is to replace him, it would be Reed, a decision that would mean the safety for Earth, but a life of servitude in aiding massacres throughout the cosmos. Reed declines the offer, believing that he would rather fight to the bitter end, and if he fails, he dies beside his family. We then pick up with Franklin as he arrives to Wakanda, seeing his wife and children. T'Challa approaches and speaks with him regarding Franklin's psionic abilities. Franklin's had them since he was a child, but he spent decades suppressing their use. T'Challa gives him a vibranium headband that will amplify his abilities. You might be asking why, and I'll tell you, it's a plot device. No, literally, it's a device for the plot. It's especially obnoxious that it's only set up to be utilized later in this issue. The purpose for the narrative principle of Chekhov's gun is to refine a story down so everything functions to serve the plot. If an idea is introduced, then it should serve the characters or the story. The term derives from the meaning that if a gun is shown in the beginning of the story, then by the end it should go off. It's an establishment of tension, but also it's a narrative indication to the audience, rewarding them for paying attention. I say this because the headband is the antithesis of this principle. The time from setup to payoff doesn't reward the reader. It's like Russell had gotten up to the point in the story where they needed to have some sort of MacGuffin, and then he retrofitted this headband idea and used that previously in the issue. It's like Cheddar Bob in 8 Mile, buys a gun and immediately shoots himself in the dick. Later, Surfer is contacted for a meeting with Dr. Doom. Doom offers a proposition to bring back to Galactus, one that he believes to solve both problems simultaneously. Doom suggests that they strike an agreement for Earth, stating that he will bend the knee and in exchange, he be declared sovereign over the planet. In doing so, Doom guarantees the population will submit to his will, and he could implement an aggressive breeding program, thus providing for sacrifices of 500 million people per year. Okay, so there's multiple issues with this, but let's just start with the math. In 2004, the year that this issue takes place, there were roughly 6.5 billion people on the planet. If Doom was to keep his promise to Galactus, then the planet would only survive for 13 years. So mathematically, this offering falls apart. Now we need to focus on who Dr. Doom is. Victor Von Doom was born in Latveria, with his parents being Cynthia and Werner. They belong to a tribe of Romani people. This is important. Romani people traditionally are referred to as nomadic, meaning that they never sought dominion over one area, and instead uprooted their lives and traveled in mass migrations. Due to their lack of nationalistic identity that was brought on by their culture, they were ostracized and persecuted. Nations would demonize the Roma, specifically playing on the fears of outsiders. They would be enslaved and stripped of their culture. Discrimination would result in hundreds of years of persecution, and during World War II, they were victimized to the same severity as Jews by the Nazis. I say this to explain why Doom, a man from a lineage of discrimination, suggesting the use of death camps is not only bad for that character, but is deeply problematic. Not only is this signaling to me that there's a lack of editorial oversight, but the implications are troubling. Returning to the story, we watch as Reed fails yet another experiment, and Sue begs him to stop with his self-destructive path. There are only 2 years left, and it's time that they made the most of it. Reed finally accepts this, and the two are reunited. As the clock ticks down to merely hours before their final days, the family has one last night out filled with laughter and cheer. Everything is ending, but they finally have enough time to enjoy each other's company. Silver Surfer appears once again, stating that Galactus would soon arrive and makes the offer one last time for Reed to take his place. Reed reluctantly accepts, to the surprise of the entire family. We follow as Surfer informs Galactus of Reed accepting the mantle, with him subsequently being stripped of his power cosmic. A ship arrives to the scene with somebody speaking to Galactus that we're supposed to assume is Reed, but it's not. It's Franklin, with the rest of the family in tow, or so we think. Reed is behind on Earth, manning the project he's worked on throughout this time, being revealed of their true mission. Franklin is there to siphon the power cosmic from Galactus, and Reed's machine would allow for containment. The only problem is that Reed must work as a catalyst for receiving said energy. Reed is able to do this, which results in him being put into a permanent vegetative state, sacrificing his autonomy to save the world and all future potential victims of Galactus. And that's where it ends. I mean, can you believe that? I thought for sure we were gonna come back to Dr. Doom. Huh? It's not over. We still have one more issue. Man, what the fuck? The final issue picks up in 2014, revealing the aftermath of Galactus's defeat. The narration states, "Once the threat of Galactus was gone, our global unity fell apart. Or perhaps it never existed. Perhaps all our imminent destruction represented was a short break from ourselves. Doom had spent the peace building an army of Doombots. As he began conquering his neighbors, most chose to ignore what was happening to nations that they never particularly cared for. Because the truth is, people never truly rally to meet a common threat, so long as they despise each other. No crisis is so great that it will change who we are," which I suppose is the real crisis. The perspective seemingly refocuses to Reed once again, serving as the omniscient narrator. Remember this, we're going to come back to it later. All of the first generation of heroes have now outlived their ability to combat Doom, and this leads to legacy characters taking their place. These would include Spider-Man Miles Morales, Ironheart, and Captain Marvel Carol Danvers. Sue arrives to Stark Retirement Haven for Heroes, home of Captain America, hoping to recruit him to rejoin the fight against Doom. Steve rejects her offer, saying that his days as Captain America are done. Once again, the story is missing the character's motivation. As long as there's fascism, there's always going to be a Captain America to fight it. I could also talk about the allusions by way of Dr. Doom towards the Holocaust, but I'm exhausted and the script is already way too long. We then cut forward to 2016, showing the new heroes teaming up with the previous generation and taking on the Doombots currently occupying the foreign nation of Symkaria. Once Doom catches word of his failure, he quickly opts to kill the Mad Thinker, whom created the Doombots and who is responsible for their failure. This is when it's revealed that the Mad Thinker had left a robot in his stead and has fled from Doom's control. In this manic state, Doom confronts the heroes in Symkaria, seeing this as his last opportunity to wipe out the last stand of dissent. When he seemingly has the upper hand, Captain America appears in a triumphant moment to punch the tyrant in the face. As a final Hail Mary, Doom initiates the annihilation mode for his Doombots, which causes them to systematically decimate humanity. The story then picks back up with Reed, showing that his mind is imprisoned inside of an unfunctioning body. While he's recounting his life up to this point, Johnny appears as a manifestation of his imagination. We witness multiple attempts by Franklin to use his psionic abilities to reach Reed telepathically, to no avail. Finally, exasperated and out of options, Franklin goes to the rooftops and witnesses the Doombots' formation around the city. That is, until one Doombot arrives and reveals that the Mad Thinker is inside. Thinker explains that there's only one man who's able to put an end to Doom, Reed Richards. He works alongside Franklin to make this last-ditch effort to establish contact. point. Internally, Reed argues with Johnny, being the literal personification of Reed's perceived failures for the people that he loves. After making the realization, Reed is able to make one last motion to locate and activate the AI he created to replace him in his stead. Using this as the Deus Ex Machina, Franklin and the Mad Thinker are able to stop the annihilation programming for the Doombots, thus winning the day. The final 3 pages show as the family is packing up the Baxter building, moving on to start a new life. This is when the AI is prompted to speak for Reed, saying everything he always meant to say, but will never have the ability to again. This is supposed to be a cathartic moment, releasing the family of their pent-up frustrations, but it's just not. With Spider-Man Life Story, it allows for the narrative to come full circle. It provided for a bittersweet ending to the character, as well as a summarization of what Zdarsky thinks Spider-Man to be. This ending just manufactures the emotion, and it doesn't sit with you after you think about it for a second. It's the last words that Reed can express to his family, something that he has been meaning to say his whole life, and he just does it by proxy. His greatest sacrifice is giving up his autonomy to save his family. This last moment should give a vibrancy to his words, but because of the issues in pacing, we don't know who any of these characters truly are, and really all of them are just defined in their relationship and proximity to Reed. If this story sought out to reimagine Marvel's first family, you would think that they would give more time to fleshing out these characters.
I feel like this is a problem in Spider-Man, and I think it's a more prevalent problem in this book, is that characters take a backseat to plot in this, especially when it gets into the issues where it's like, look, here's the Avengers, here's Doctor Doom, here's the Mad Thinker, here's Miles Morales, and here's all these characters in the final issue. It feels very much like the book is more about just plot and world building and kind of like filling out a wiki than it is about story and character and narrative and those kind of things. And I think that like what Chip and Bagley did on Spider-Man manages to find a relatively good balance of the two, of still being very plotty and doing a lot of like ticking the boxes of what fans would want to see, while still telling a really compelling story of Peter's trials and tribulations as he grows. And I don't think that if Reed is supposed to be the main character of this, which he's very much kind of positioned as, he doesn't have the same emotional arc. He's kind of like sad broken man, and then at the end of the book he's sad broken man that saved the world. So this kind of ties into something I was going to bring up, which is one of my bigger frustrations and one of my major stumbling blocks with really enjoying this book, which is, and maybe this is me as like an overprotective parent that is so like thinks about the Fantastic Four more than most normal people do, and especially Reed. Like Reed Richards is one of my all-time favorite comic book characters. I am a very angry and defending parent whenever I see people talking about how Reed is cold and emotionless and he's a bad husband and father, like, and that unfortunately is a lot of people's perception of Reed, and that's how he's been written in, you know, books like Civil War and big event stories and just kind of general cultural osmosis. I guess things like The Maker has only like reinforced that as well. But yeah, I think that one of my big issues with this book is I don't really like Mark Russell's take on Reed Richards, and there's a positive and there's a negative to that, and I'll go with the positive first. I really like the idea, and this seems to be something that the new movie is borrowing, linking the Fantastic Four's origin to the coming of Galactus, because like for Reed at least, that is like a major moment of tragedy. He has destroyed his love and his friends' lives forever. You know, there's that classic page from the Wade Ringo run where he's telling the story to Valeria, and it's like, well, I give them this new life as celebrities and superheroes to hopefully make up for the life that I destroyed of theirs. Reed is a really tragic figure, and to add to that guilt and anxiety, you also now have this looming dread of, I've awoken something. We fucked with nature and it hurt us, and now whatever is coming eventually, whenever it happens, you know, it takes place over a 50-year period, it will all be my fault. You know, Reed is a character kind of defined by this constant pressure he feels to save the world and to use his gifts and to use his intellect to be a force for good and to provide necessary change, and to know that something inevitable is coming and it's going to be his fault and it is the destroyer of all things is a really powerful arc for that character. And I think that's a really cool way of linking Galactus to Reed and and bringing all that full circle in a really nice way. However, the execution of it plays into a lot of what I think are negative stereotypes with the Mr. Fantastic character. You know, this image of a guy who's just kind of in his lab constantly ignoring his wife and children, where he's so kind of lasered in and hyper focused on his research. It comes at the expense of being present for those he loves. And I don't think it's intentional. And I don't want to say that Mark Russell doesn't get characters in a gatekeeping sense, but I do think, unfortunately, some of the choices made in this story play into some of what I find are quite frustrating stereotypes with the Reed Richards character. And this plays into a larger issue, which we'll talk about, which is my conflicted feelings on the approach that Russell takes in this book versus what Zdarsky does with Spider-Man, which is the Spider-Man life story is like a celebration of the history of Peter Parker. And it's tying in as much from as many different writers and artists and many runs as possible to tell this very tightly condensed love letter to the character's history. And for all of my kind of nitpicks and problems with that book, I think it does that very well. I don't think Russell set out for this book to be a celebration of the Fantastic Four necessarily. If anything, it's quite a tragic story, especially with how the characters end up by the end of the book. And obviously the Fantastic Four's origin is rooted in tragedy and loss and grief and having to kind of make the best out of the situation. But it feels that like by the time the book ends, Reed Richards is a very tragic figure. He kind of loses pretty much everything, including his own himself. He's kind of trapped in his own body. And even the closing moments where him and Sue kind of reconcile and reunite, I think is supposed to be a really sweet and nice moment where it's like these two characters are finally back together with all the distractions gone. But I read it as a really sad and tragic end of this man who has kind of spent his whole life trying to solve these problems and to save the world and also try and be, you know, a present husband and father and friend, and ends up kind of trapped inside himself and pretty much having lost everything. I think there's definitely a conversation around intent versus execution in this series. I don't think Mark Russell intends to play into what I consider to be kind of bad stereotypes with the Reed Richards character. But I think in the execution and the way that the story unfolds, as kind of a very biased defender of Reed Richards and someone that has a very particular take on that character, slightly frustrated me upon kind of revisiting this book.
I typically don't seek out to talk about books that I don't like, because I usually like to dedicate my time to talking about books that I appreciate or creators that I like. Obviously, this was an exception. Even with the flaws in this book, I think that there are some aspects that I thought were interesting. I really do believe that utilizing the narrative device to switch perspectives with each issue is inspired. Additionally, I really appreciated the work done by artist Sean Isaacs and the supplemental artists Angel Anzuta and Zay Carlos. There are some scenes that really capture the emotional resonance of each of the interactions. Unfortunately, I just don't think it was every single one. And ultimately, the art cannot exceed the script.
I think it's a really gorgeous looking series. I think it complements the visual style that Bagley uses in Spider-Man while being distinct enough. It could have been very easy for whoever's drawing the life story books to draw each issue in a super stylized way. That the 1960s is someone trying to draw like Jack Kirby, you know. In the 1990s, everyone's kind of looking like a Rob Liefeld character. It would have been very easy to do that, and I'm quite glad that they don't, and they just create their own visual identity and language and sprinkle in little bits of iconography around each decade, but for the most part have its own distinct look.
It's really unproductive to assert that Mark Russell had bad intentions or that he's a bad writer because I didn't like this one miniseries. At the end of the day, I think this video, the script, the editing, the amount of time that I'm putting into it is all yearning for a project that I wish it was.
But it's certainly a book of two halves, and I think that while it's a book I do have a lot of conflicting feelings on overall, I do appreciate that you have essentially held me at gunpoint and forced me to revisit it, because I read it when it came out, didn't have the best time with it, and never really gone back and reconsidered it. And while my opinion hasn't like done a complete 180, it's at least allowed me to think deeper about this series and to think about, even with the stuff I don't like, why don't I like them? Where did the message get lost, and where did the things I do like kind of maybe go off the rails a little bit? So I do appreciate that, at least.
Fantastic Four Life Story was seen as a failure by Marvel and subsequently canceled any further entries going forward. In the wake of this story, we've seen Marvel kind of distance itself from stories that are titled life story, but we have seen books through different formats that are doing generally the same idea. Specifically Ant-Man by Al Ewing and Tom Riley, which dissects how mantles and legacy affect a hero over time. As a Daredevil fan, I'm always going to be a little disappointed that Ann Nocenti didn't come back and write Daredevil life story. That's not me making it up either. Ann Nocenti was going to come back and write that book. So maybe I'm just disappointed for what could have been. But hey, that's comics for you. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which character you wish also got a life story treatment. Thanks to Lord Edge and my supporters over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel, consider joining with a membership for as low as $1 per month. And last but not least, go read some comics, or else.